at all, my dad and I.
So then did you follow your instincts and go into that lifestyle then?
Yeah, so what happened, as I look back on it, and I've heard many, many stories that are similar to mine and had lots of conversations. My wife, Melissa, and I both come out of homosexuality, and she also has some significant heterosexual brokenness in her background. But we know hundreds of people personally that have come out of homosexuality. So many stories while they're all unique, every story is unique, there are some common themes. There's always some outliers that don't necessarily fit into the what's common, but there are often common themes. And so for me, being a boy, experiencing a lot of rejection, and in the vacuum of that, what God meant for me to receive, what was legitimate need on my part to receive from my father, to be poured into by my brothers and male peers, in not getting that, and then pushing away from it, and only kind of marinating in the world of the feminine all throughout my developmental years. What was mysterious to me when I hit puberty wasn't girls. I knew all about girls. What was mysterious to me was my own gender.
Wow. And what other types of personal experiences have lined up with other people's trends in that area? Do you mind asking?
No. I mean, oftentimes there's a break. I mean, even though it's unpopular, politically incorrect, I mean, the reality is it's true. We've just heard story after story of people, that guys in particular, that were disconnected from their fathers in some way. And not because their dads necessarily were bad. In some cases, they weren't good fathers. Many times they were great fathers, but the way that a child processes information, the way that they perceive things, that's their reality. And that's what they act on. And so there's this perception of a dad that maybe not be very loving or very available. And divorce is often a common problem there too. And then again, just rejection by our own peers, usually the sense that I'm different than. Often guys that get involved in homosexuality are highly sensitive and pick up on a lot of things kind of going on around them that other boys don't necessarily pick up on all that much. Empathetic, tend to be more artistic, those kinds of things as well. For women, there's more diversity, honestly. Sometimes women have had no attraction to one another. They might have been married, maybe through a bad marriage or some bad experiences in childhood. She's married, goes through a divorce or what have you, gets involved with another woman emotionally, maybe through a Bible study even. And there's a bond that forms that where there's not an ability, or there's not an understanding of the need for boundaries around that, as good as it is.
So a codependent
and it can shift from codependence into a sexual relationship. And so women tend to be more sexually fluid than men in that way.
Yeah, interesting. So where did Christ come into your life? Or was that early on or further down the road?
Well, I mean, Christ and God I was aware of them from the time I could be aware, because we went to church all the time. I went to a church that taught a lot of truth, but didn't model love and compassion well at all. And I didn't experience much of that in my home. So I prayed the sinner's prayer actually a number of times growing up, but it was never out of it. Like I didn't like God at all. Like I hated him. And I felt like he was an ogre that demanded we love him, but I didn't want to go to hell. So I had this very twisted view of God. So it wasn't until my early 20s when I had done the whole bar scene, left Bible college, and went off into homosexuality, and just said,
you went to Bible college and then said, nope, never mind.
And I was kicked out of Bible college because they were concerned that I might be suicidal. I mean, I had a lot of emotional problems. And so when that experience happened, I just said, to heck with you, God. Not quite that word, and the church, and
word usage.
and I didn't want to have any. I was so angry because I had prayed and prayed and prayed all through my childhood. God, I want to follow you. Take this away, and I just felt like the silence was evidence that he didn't give a rip about me. Now I know, looking back, what I think God was absolutely heartbroken. What I firmly believe is that God will not do for us what he desires us to do for ourselves, but he also won't do for us what he wants his community and his church to do. So the church had a big role to play in helping a little boy or young girls, I mean, and now too. And it's not just as if God's going to wave his wand. We're relationally broken, and the way that is worked out in life is we're made whole in healthy relationships.
Yes.
And that happens through the church. So I look back, and rather than seeing God as an ogre,
we want it to happen through the church.
It can also get broken through the church.
It gets broken through the church, but I think God we don't receive the healing we need unless the church steps up to the plate. And of course, we're the church.
We are the church.
And so we want to bring influence in positive ways into the church. As good as the church is in many ways, this is an area of sexuality, areas around LGBT issues and all that. The church does not do it right.
And we pretend it's not an issue.
Yes.
And politically, we sweep it under the rug because we don't want to be controversial or be seen as judgmental.
Right. Yes. And there's plenty of heterosexual stuff to deal with in the church. I mean, the stats are so off the chart for men in the church dealing with pornography addiction, women as well on the increase, and plenty of Christian leaders too.
Sure.
So,
and if we don't want to get it wrong, so we don't want to talk about it at all.
Right.
Well, and sexual sin is sexual sin.
Yes.
I keep saying this. If you would judge somebody for being in a heterosexual, inappropriate relationship outside of marriage, then that's the same attitude towards a homosexual relationship outside of God's plan or any other.
Right.
Like, God calls it all sin, and he calls gossiping, anger, murder, and stealing all those kinds of sins.
In Proverbs 6, he says there are 6 things that God hates, 7 that are an abomination. The last thing on that list is someone who spreads strife amongst community.
Right.
That happens all the time in church. And the word abomination is used there.
Yeah.
We typically reserve that word, is equal to homosexuality, right? And of course it is. But there's plenty of other stuff going on in the church that also rises to that level.
And I don't think anybody has room to be self-righteous or judgmental at any level on any of this. And to me, that's a bigger judgment on the church than anything else, is that Jesus never judged anybody for being real and broken.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
But he judged a lot of people for being fake and putting on the whited sepulcher, filled with death inside. And that's why I'm thrilled that we can talk about this stuff here and just say these are real issues.
Well, along this line, there's one important piece, I think, that it used to be that everybody knew John 3:16, even in the world. People knew the salvation verse. Now, one of the most commonly quoted verses is Matthew 7:1, where Jesus says, "Judge not, lest you be judged," right? And then we put a period there, and that's the end of it. But if you follow that out, several verses, what he's saying is don't make a healthy judgment, because we have to assess where someone is at.
Definitely.
What he's saying is don't ignore your sin and focus on someone else's sin. Deal with your own sin so you can actually be in a place where you can help your brother or sister deal with their sin. He's not saying don't make an assessment, and that verse is quoted in such a way that's saying, you shouldn't even consider whether someone is doing well or not doing well. That's ridiculous. Of course we're called to that.
Right.
But it's not fair that I have to be celibate just because I'm not married.
It's not fair.
It's not fair.
It's not.
I get told that, and that's again a judgment call on following God and obeying him versus what would feel good. And the fact that I am divorced, in God's eyes, I don't get to have sexual relations, doesn't matter who I'm attracted to.
Right.
And that's a piece of just understanding, like a fire that gets out of control and destroys things.
Absolutely.
When it's not in a fireplace.
Right.
That God created sexuality to be such a blessing within the confines of what?
The confines of his original design.
Of what he said.
It gives life in that context. When it falls out of the stove, I used that earlier this weekend. When the fire goes out of the stove, the destruction can just wreak havoc on the entire home.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So then when in your story you said you left Bible college, you went the complete other direction. Where did God meet you and convict you?
Well, it felt like I'd finally found my people when I went to my first gay bar. I was 19, and I didn't fit in my home. I didn't fit in the church. And so I was there day after day after day. And it was it felt so good to finally be in a place where, like, people, it wasn't even about sex at that point. It was just about relationship. It was about other people like me. Yeah.
Right.
And so, but it quickly moved into a relationship. I got involved with a guy that I met there and moved in with him. And my original desire to find Mr. Right and settle down for the rest of my life, that ship sailed very quickly, because the nature of the lifestyle is not one that is given to monogamy, although that's what everybody wants us to believe these days. That really is a bunch of nonsense. I'm not saying that there aren't relationships like that happen, but they're not normative. They're not the
average.
Yeah, the average. So after a number of years of getting dumped and finding somebody else and getting dumped again and then dumping them. I mean, just this circular relational, moving from one person to another. I began to really feel the decay on my soul. And a verse that you started to reference earlier, when Paul says flee sexual immorality, he also says, he goes on from there and says, all sins that a man or woman, I think, commits is outside the body, but the one who sins sexually sins against their own body. There's a unique kind of damage that's done.
Definitely.
So I began to feel that after a few years and felt like an old man in my early 20s. And so I just had an experience that I won't have time to get into, but I had an experience of listening to a Christian song. I was angry with God, and somehow I'm still finding myself listening to some Christian music, and it was new music, and there was a lyric in it that just laid me bare. And I was driving on the interstate in New Jersey, and I had to pull my car over because I started bawling. And I'd become as hard as a rock, and I never cried about anything. And I just started sobbing and pulled over, and just my salvation prayer wasn't the nice little, Romans Road.
Right.
It was, Jesus, I don't know if you even want what's left of me. I've made such a wreck of my life, but if you want it, you can have it. It was the first time I'd surrendered, as opposed to just trying to buy fire insurance, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
we talk about that a lot. Okay.
And in
surrender,
in the Bloom in the Dark book that came out 2 years ago, I know this because we talked about it 2 years ago. It has a female version of your kind of story.
Beautiful
in there
story,
with a friend of mine. And the journey, it goes into detail in her journey of how God got a hold of her and changed. And she has a baby, by the way.
That's awesome.
Her husband, they had a baby, and it's just seeing the restoration of not just the person, but the relationships, the family, the fact that your wife and children and God brought in so much
There's
healing.
a lot of intentional choices in that.
Many. There are a lot of intentional choices, and it's about so much more than just being abstinent. It's about so much more than just not having sex with a guy. It's about what that was a beginning in terms of ending behavior that God, the word clearly says this isn't God's plan for us. But beyond that, I was still this kind of shell of a man. There was this idea, I felt like I was a third gender. I didn't feel like I didn't have a desire to be a woman, but I certainly did not feel like a man either. And so it wasn't until my early 30s and getting involved in a church with a healthy enough men's group, which was the last place on earth I wanted to be. I just went out of obedience to the Lord, and felt like these guys came alongside of me and really called out who I was as a man, and something began to take root. And so now, I love being a husband to my wife, a father to my boys, and a spiritual father to many men dealing with heterosexual issues.
Which is amazing.
Wow. And your organization is Love and Truth Network, correct?
It is Love and Truth Network. I do a part-time role with Transforming Congregations, which is for the United Methodist Church, but Love and Truth Network is for the broader church.
That's amazing. And that is why you are our ex-victim of the week,
Right.
Gary.
Awesome.
Thank you so much
Thank you.
for sharing.
Thank you.
I love that. You've said that it's not just you. There's hundreds, and there's another story that's out there that isn't being broadcast.
So many.
So thank you for sharing so much of your story and brokenness.
You are welcome.
So that you can absolutely use the fertilizer of your past
to bloom
today.
A free PDF copy of the Bloom in the Dark book and a full list of Bloom Today's coaching tools can be found on bloomtodaytv.com. Then visit Bloom Today's Facebook group for deeper conversation.